Hey there, YouTube. I've got some sad news. Your time has come. The Reaper is here. That's right. It's time for us to talk about death. Okay, hey everyone, my name's Mark. Welcome to Bumbling Through Dungeons. Today's topic is death. And not the most fun topic, but one that I think needs to be discussed in D&D because it is an ever-present specter. Or is it? So sticking with a theme of some recent videos, I'm going to start with a question. Do you need death in your campaign, in your adventures? And when we've asked this question in the past, do you need to do voices at the table? The answer was an unequivocal no. You can, and it can be really fun, but you don't need to. Do you need music at your table? Again, if used appropriately, it can enhance your game, but no, you don't need it. Do you need death at the table? This is a little bit trickier question, and we're going to have to unpack it a little bit because I think saying either yes or no unequivocally would be doing a disservice to this topic. So I actually think there are two questions here. Do you need death, and should you have death in your campaign? And on the latter of those questions, I first want to talk about the areas where I think that answer is no, because it's not every game. It's very contextual, but I think there are some times where you probably shouldn't have death. And the first is when you're running the game for kids. So I've had kids in games once or twice. I've never run a campaign. I don't have kids myself. And I think a lot of the people that end up running the game for kids are those where they'll have a son or daughter and then, or, multiple kids who will play, and then their friends will come over and maybe they'll be running a game for their children and their children's friends. And especially with younger children, I think this can be a little bit traumatic. And so, especially in the early sessions, until they're all familiar with the game and familiar with the idea that death might be present, I wouldn't even consider it. I think there's a lot of ways D&D and gaming, in a larger sense, RPGs, board games, can be used with children to teach interesting lessons. So for each child, there's probably a moment where you can introduce the concept and introduce it as a real possibility in the world. Probably I would introduce it first through things like NPCs and enemies who maybe have some sympathetic qualities to them so that it hits a little bit more home for the kids who are playing in the game rather than just killing, mindless monsters that don't really seem too sympathetic. So I would introduce it slowly and eventually get up to the point where, yes, maybe there could be player death, but by that point I would have prepped the group and made sure that they're okay with the concept and with it potentially happening at the table. There's one other case that I think is a fringe case, and that's with first-time players. Now, I really want to be able to say that I don't have kid gloves when I'm DMing for first-time players, but in practice, I think this probably just isn't true. Because I'm always worried that I'm going to kill a brand new player who's maybe showing up for their first session ever, playing in their first session ever, figuring out the game, figuring out whether or not they like it, whether they want to come back, whether they want to one day try their hand at DMing or joining a campaign or even just playing occasionally. And I always worry that killing off their character, who maybe they're real excited to play and think that they might want to revisit later on, I worry that killing that character so early on is going to ruin their enjoyment. Now, there's probably plenty of people for whom that's not true, but I can't jump inside the head of my players, and so I tend to err on the side of caution. So the few times where this has come up, I've sort of pulled my punches, and I feel better about that than if I was as merciless with a brand new player as I sometimes am with my long-term dedicated players who understand that death's a real possibility at the table and want death to be a possibility at the table. But I don't know that there's a clear-cut answer for first-time players. So if you explained it to them and said, hey, your character might absolutely die, and they seemed super cool with that, and were interested to see whether or not their character would die, I would probably be okay with it, and you can probably be okay with it. So it's very contextual. But that leads me into my next point, probably the biggest and most important point of this entire video, and that's on communications. So we touched on it way back in one of my earlier videos on session 0, where we talked about bringing up the possibility of death and how it will be handled in session 0 before you start playing, so that if you're running a campaign with players, they understand whether or not death's going to be a possibility, to what extent it will be present in the game, like how deadly do you think this campaign will be? Should they be rolling up a backup character now, or should they just try not to do anything stupid and they'll probably be okay most of the time? But regardless of the answers to those questions, I would hit it early and often to make sure that everybody's on the same page. I think if everyone's on the same page, there's no wrong answer to how you handle death, how frequently it occurs at your table, whether that answer is never to quite frequently. Any of those can be acceptable, but I think it all starts with proper communication and understanding where everyone is when it comes to this issue. To that extent, it's also good to communicate the type of campaign that you're running. Now, if you're running a one-shot, this is a little bit trickier, and you can't really communicate, oh, here's how present death is going to be, because you yourself may not know. It might be something you're running for the first time. But with a lot of campaigns, or if you get used to a particular style of DMing, it might be much harder for your players. It might be not quite as hard. There are official adventures from Wizards of the Coast where there's a much likelier possibility of death than in others. So one example is Tomb of Annihilation, which has some, I guess, grindhouse dungeons, for lack of a better term, where there is a strong possibility of one or more deaths within your party. A lot of players love this, but not every player might know this going in. So it's important to prepare, to prompt your players to let them know what type of dungeon you're playing. The famous old module of Gary Gygax's The Tomb of Horrors was the most classic example of this, where you should not expect to survive it. You should expect to die when you play the Tomb of Horrors, and it did get updated for 5th edition, and from what I hear, it's not much different. It is perhaps slightly easier and slightly fairer, but you should still really expect to just die a horrible death if you play this. That is kind of the point of it. The fun comes with how long can we survive, can we survive, and all of the interesting traps and death mechanisms in this module that DMs get to play with and players get to contend with. And even if your game is a homebrew one, there are many different types of campaigns, but I think broadly you can say that you might have sort of a mega dungeon, combat-centric campaign. These are probably going to be ones where it's more expected that death is going to be omnipresent. So it's always going to be a possibility. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have sort of your narrative campaigns that are very much plot-driven. And if, say, there's a TPK, it's not like, say, you're delving into a mega dungeon, and if everybody dies, you roll up new players and then trek down to that level of the dungeon and keep going. In a narrative, plot-driven campaign, this is much more difficult because you've established a storyline surrounding your characters. So this is where I think the gray line starts to occur for many DMs, and where it's much more interesting and nuanced to have this discussion. For myself, I think that death always needs to be a real possibility, and I think it needs to have I think it needs to be able to inspire a certain level of fear in the players in order for combat and the campaign as a whole to have dramatic tension. If players don't think they're ever really at risk of dying, how will that affect play? How will that affect their investment in the characters and in the world around them? How will that affect their engagement? And I think usually if they don't think they're going to die, if they don't think they can die, the answer is it's going to affect it negatively. So maybe that's not the case with your group, but certainly for me, I would feel like I was missing out on something if I could just throw myself into any situation being reasonably certain that I wasn't going to die. And again, for me, when I think about D&D and what I really love about it, it's the moments that are the most of one thing. So the most drama, the funniest, the saddest, the most tragic, the most exciting, the weirdest. So it's these extremes that you find in the game, And so when I'm DMing, I'm trying to create opportunities for the very dramatic things to happen, for very strange or silly, for very epic, for very tragic, sometimes, frankly, things to happen. I'm not ever trying to kill my players, but again, you might have a moment where a player dies, where a character dies, and it becomes a very memorable, tragic, poignant moment within the campaign. I think that you're doing a disservice to the breadth of the D&D experience if you don't ever get to experience a moment like that. So when I run a game, it is almost universally going to be a possibility. It's almost universally going to be present, except for those few exceptions that I mentioned earlier. And I think across the hobby, that is the norm, but it is worth thinking about to make sure that you understand how you want to handle it as a DM and that your players understand how you're handling it as a DM. Now, as you get adept at balancing encounters to the difficulty level that, or the difficulty setting that you're going for in a particular encounter, you get better at creating encounters that are the appropriate level of deadliness depending on what you envision for it. Of course, you're rolling dice at the table, so encounters can always end up differently than you or the players suspect it will. But in general, if you create really easy encounters where there should be low chance of death, in practice, they will be relatively easy encounters with a low chance of death. And vice versa, if you create a lot of deadly encounters, eventually one of your players, one of your PCs will die. And you can get better at balancing this and tweaking this, and you don't have to have the same difficulty level throughout. It might be an essentially deadly campaign, but you can still have pushover fights, or fights that are meant to push the players or deplete their resources and health, but not necessarily kill any of them. So there are a lot of different uses for different types of encounters that don't all have to be, I want to kill you, or I want this to be super easy. And to be clear, death is never the goal for me as a DM, because to me that seems a bit vengeful, and I'm not sure that's the correct role for the DM. The villains can be vengeful, but if the DM out of character is vengeful, then you probably have some interpersonal issues you need to deal with. But there are encounters I create where I say, okay, this is a dramatic moment, or this is a big villain who's had time to prep, or whatever the case may be, and it would be a disservice to the campaign if I made it anything but potentially deadly for the players. And that includes the entire party, not just one or two of them. So up to and including a TPK. Now, I should note, I've never TPK'd a group so far in my DMing career. I suspect it will happen at some point. It will never be the goal, but there are encounters that I create where if things go poorly for the group, it could be deadly to one or more of them. So you as a DM sometimes, especially in plot-driven, narrative-driven campaigns, if this is the type of tension you want to create and you want to create potentially deadly encounters, you have to make yourself okay with the idea that your story might not finish, that you might have a TPK and it might not have been the intended outcome, but if that is the outcome, that might be the end of this particular story. Now, the great thing about D&D is that there's an infinity of stories that can be told by you and your players. But I think there's a certain poignancy to having a big plot-driven campaign and the players and PCs working together to try to, do whatever the goal is and failing. That might not seem as satisfying as victory, but if it's not a possibility, if that possibility isn't present at all, how hollow will that victory seem? So for my games, death does need to be present, even in the big plot narrative-driven campaigns, and it needs to be present because while the victory in the campaign, if they complete the goal, whatever it may be, while that may seem very sweet, while that may be the ideal ending, how hollow will that seem if failure isn't an actual possibility? So that's a question you have to ask and answer for yourself, and your answer may be different than mine. So that takes us through the philosophical side of death in D&D. One other thing that I want to touch on is death at higher levels of play. This is a question that I see a lot and that I've considered as well along with my players. Again, you can always communicate with your players to say, how do we want to handle this? Because there is a strain of thought within the D&D community that as you get to higher levels and you start to gain access to fairly reliable resurrection magic, that it trivializes death. That if you have one or more players with access to this magic in the party, that you don't really have to worry about death. That the only thing that could stop the party is an entire TPK, or say if someone dies and their body disappears or is taken away or something along those lines. But if they just fall in combat, that you don't actually have to worry because you're always going to be able to resurrect them. Is it too trivial at these higher levels? And again, answers vary, and I don't think there's one correct answer. But I looked at the rules for resurrection magic, and with any sized party, I said to myself, you know what? They are eventually, once they get to these levels, someone's going to have access to these spells. Do I want to make it an auto resurrection? Do I want to make it this easy for them to come back to life? And for me, the answer was no. And so this is one of the few things that I house rule. If I can avoid house rules, I do. I don't like to change too much from the base game, but this is one thing that I have changed. So I use some house rules that make resurrection magic not assured. And somewhat well known, and some of you out there will probably know of this, but Matt Mercer in the Critical Role game uses a house rule around resurrection magic as well. I don't do the exact same thing that he does, but it is somewhat similar. So basically what I do is the DC is at 10 to resurrect somebody. And so when you cast a resurrection spell, you roll a d20 and you add whatever your spell casting modifier is. For healers and people with res magic, it's usually going to be wisdom or sometimes charisma or intelligence, but you add whatever that modifier is, and if it's 10 or higher, you bring them back. If it's not, permadeath. And for example, if a revivify spell fails, then you can cast a higher level resurrection spell like Raise Dead, and you can try again. But each time you have a failed save, or each time you die, if you die multiple times and are brought back, the DC gets higher. So this is similar to Mercer's system. He makes it a little bit more complicated by adding in tributes that the PCs can add in to alter the DC up or down, which creates some really intense, interesting resurrection scenes. I haven't gone this far at my table because I found that my players that I've run with haven't necessarily wanted to take it that far, but they're very much down with resurrection magic not being assured. Another way that I've seen DMs handle this in a way that is somewhat house ruled is that they'll make resurrection magic very, very rare within the world, up to and including banning it as a spell that the players can take. So they might be unable to take Revivify or Raise Dead. And in order to get somebody raised from the dead, they might have to pay an exorbitant sum, or they might have to go on a long, arduous quest to get some component for this spell that is very rare and without which the spell will fail. So there are ways that you can make it more difficult for your players without saying, no, you can't do this. I kind of like that idea, and I may try it at some point where, okay, you can have access to these spells, but I'm adding a component to the Raise Dead spell, for example, and it's a very rare, very expensive component, so it's not necessarily something that the players will have access to, and it's not something that they'll be able to get an infinite number of. So they may only have a limited number of Raise Dead spells over the course of a campaign, depending on how much they're able to create or find or obtain whatever this component is. On the other hand, there are ways that combat can go that even parties who have resurrection magic, it could end up poorly. So, if there's an encounter and it's near a river, somebody dies and falls into the river and their body is whisked away, does the party can they find the body to be able to resurrect it? Or does one of the villains take it away for some nefarious purpose? There are different ways that you can handle this to make it so that resurrection is not assured and make it a little bit more difficult on your players. But at the same time, there are DMs who say, you know what? No, if they take these spells, I want to reward them. They can cast them, and it's rules as written. They come back from the dead. Everything's okay. And that's fine too. So I feel like this video has been a little bit different than some of the others because a lot of what I've said is just considerations and opinions. And I think more than anything, it's worth having this conversation with your players and thinking about these things on your own, because the answers to the questions to those conversations, however they come about and end, those will dictate where a lot of the tension exists in your game surrounding the idea of death. But I hope at least that I've given you some food for thought on the topic, and more than anything, I will wish you good luck in your games. I hope your characters never die and that you never have to worry about any of this. But inevitably, when you do, I hope that this has given you a little bit more of a primer so that you are ready for death and what it brings to your D&D game. So that's it. Until next time, take care. So I've got this idea. It's beyond me, but it's $1 million idea. You license the rights to One Night in Bangkok, but the music, not the lyrics, just the music. And then you create a YouTube channel. It's just called One Night In. And you create lyrics for hundreds of different versions of this song for like every franchise known to man. So like anything with 2 syllables you could do. One night in Skyrim, one night in Grayskull. Like have Skeletor and Manny faces doing sexy dances. Like fans would eat it up. That video would have 15 million views in like a day. So if anyone wants to steal it, like if you have enough talent to like make hundreds of versions of this song, like you have my permission, because I would watch the shit out of that channel. Like all I want is to hear One Night in Grayskull. Now I don't even know what the lyrics would be, but it would be the highlight of whatever month I see it in.